The institution of slavery existed in what is now the United States from the colonial period until the end of the Civil War in 1865. Slavery was a system of forced labor in which people were treated as property and denied basic rights and freedoms. African slaves were brought to the colonies beginning in the early 17th century to work primarily on tobacco and rice plantations. Over time, the slave trade became a major part of the global economy, with millions of Africans forcibly transported to the Americas. Slaves were treated as property and had no legal rights. They were often subjected to brutal treatment, including physical abuse and sexual exploitation. Families were often separated, with husbands, wives, and children sold off to different plantations. Slaves worked long hours in difficult conditions, with little food, clothing, or shelter. They were forced to live in cramped quarters and often had to make their own clothes and shoes. Slaves were denied access to education and other opportunities for self-improvement. Resistance to slavery took many forms, including rebellion, escape, and sabotage. Some slaves were able to gain their freedom through manumission, which was the legal process of being granted freedom by a slaveholder. Others were able to escape to freedom through the Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses used to help slaves escape to the north. Slavery was a deeply entrenched institution in American society, and it took a civil war to finally bring it to an end. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were to be freed. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1865, officially abolished slavery throughout the United States. The transatlantic slave trade was one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Millions of Africans were captured and forcibly transported across the Atlantic to the Americas, where they were sold into slavery. The slave trade was driven by economic factors, with the labor of enslaved Africans helping to fuel the growth of the colonial economy. Slaves were considered property and had no legal rights. They were often subjected to brutal treatment, with physical violence and sexual exploitation being common. Many slaves were forced to work in hazardous conditions, and accidents were not uncommon. Slave owners had absolute control over their slaves, and punishments for disobedience or rebellion were often severe, including whipping, branding, and even death. The lives of slaves varied depending on their location and the type of work they were engaged in. Some slaves worked on large plantations, while others worked in urban areas as skilled laborers or domestic servants. Slaves on plantations typically worked from dawn to dusk, with few breaks or days off. They were housed in cramped quarters and often had to make their own clothing and bedding. Slaves in urban areas had more opportunities for social interaction and were often able to earn money through skilled labor or entrepreneurial activities. Resistance to slavery took many forms, ranging from individual acts of rebellion to organized uprisings. Some slaves attempted to escape, either by running away or by seeking refuge with sympathetic white abolitionists. The Underground Railroad, which was a network of safe houses and secret routes used to help slaves escape to freedom, was a key element of the anti-slavery movement. The abolitionist movement gained momentum in the early 19th century, with many Americans becoming increasingly aware of the moral and political implications of slavery. The Civil War, which began in 1861, was fought in large part over the issue of slavery. The Union victory in the war led to the abolition of slavery throughout the United States. Despite the abolition of slavery, the legacy of this institution continues to be felt in American society today. Racial disparities in income, education, and healthcare can be traced back to the legacy of slavery and the systemic discrimination that followed. Efforts to promote racial justice and equality remain ongoing challenges for the United States and other nations around the world.